Hey friends, I recently ran across Matt Powell. He's one of those pathetic evangelical preachers who rails against evolution using the same old bad arguments I've heard for decades. No, really, he's just a rebooted Kent Hovind with pretty much the same shtick. He's not very interesting and he's not very effective, since he seems to be babbling his homophobic anti-science nonsense to a tiny audience, and he has half the number of subscribers that I do. And that's not me bragging. That's me pointing out that I am a pathetic, marginal YouTuber with a very small subscriber set, so that he can't even compete with me is kind of sad. Anyway, so he's a small putrid fish in a big stinky ocean. But I watched one of his videos just because I try to keep track of creationist arguments that are floating around out there, what the trends are, who's making noise, all that sort of stuff. And then he put out some irresistible bait for me. Most of it is garbage. We've all heard it before. He says, for instance, you have to have faith to be an atheist. Atheists believe nothing exploded into something. Pasteur's law of biogenesis somehow refutes the possibility of abiogenesis. He draws a pencil dot and says, hey, can we wait a few billion years for this to explode into a whole new universe? There's the usual, it takes too long to evolve even the simplest protein. And fossils on mountaintops prove the global flood, yada, 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 yada. Just drivel through and through. Okay, so he's making a bog standard Gish Gallop. And if I wanted to take apart each of his arguments, we'd be here for hours. He's just this geyser of bullshit, and I'd rather not wade through all the effluvia, if you don't mind. There was something that he whines about at the 30-minute mark, though. And that jumped out at me because I hadn't heard a creationist use it before. And B, most creationists are cunning enough to know when they're quoting crank science as if it's real science. And C, hey, I know that paper. I shredded it 2 years ago. So let's look at this one short clip out of an enormous pile of misinformation, and you'll see what I'm talking about.
Now, this is the hokey stuff, folks. So since they think that we all came from an amoeba that found some other amoeba to marry, of course, because you got to have two. You must have found something to eat. Slowly evolved into where we are today. Let's just grant all that.
Okay, wait a minute. We haven't come to the good part just yet. This is pedestrian creationist trash. No, we didn't evolve from amoebae. They're their own separate line. And no, amoebae and our distant ancestors are capable of asexual reproduction. So talking about having to have two getting married is just ludicrously ignorant. But here's the goofy part, the particularly goofy part that caught my attention.
Squids and octopuses have a different genetic build than any other creature in the world. So scientists have come to the conclusion that they couldn't have come from any other sea creature. So here's what evolutionary theory states about how they got here. Evolution says, or evolutionists claim, it says one plausible explanation in our view is that the genes are likely new extraterrestrial imports to Earth. These scientists declare that, quote, the squid eggs hitched a ride to Earth on the back of asteroids. That is what evolution teaches, folks. I am not kidding. I was in an interview with a friend of mine he's an actual creation scientist. Now, him and I don't see eye to eye on everything, but he brought this up and I thought he was joking with me. I said, are you serious? We cut for a moment. I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. This is what they teach? He said, yeah, it's what they teach. I looked it up. Sure enough, evolution teaches that they hitched a ride on the back of asteroids. Doesn't that sound fun?
All right, that is remarkable. A creationist actually looked something up, and they actually reported it accurately. There is a paper, a couple of them actually, that claim squid are not related to any other organisms on Earth, and that they arrived here as eggs on meteors, or actually comets, a few 100 million years ago. Matt has to leave that last part off because he's a young Earth creationist, so he's not going to mention that the paper he cited argues for 100 million-year-old Earth and longer. What he doesn't mention, though, is that this is the work of fringe crackpots who managed to get it published in a scientific journal with the assistance of a sympathetic crackpot editor. Where he lies is when he claims that evolution teaches that nonsense. It certainly does not. I happen to know the paper he quotes without citing it. Here it is. Okay. It was published in Progress in Biophysics and Molecular Biology, a legitimate journal, but one of its editors-in-chief is Dennis Noble, a cardiac physiologist who decided that evolution was false, that the modern synthesis needed to be discarded, and that a version of Lamarckism is the true mechanism of evolution. The lead author is Ted Steele, a credible immunologist who dived off the deep end with claims that evolution is a neo-Lamarckian process. Neither of them are trustworthy sources on the subject of evolutionary theory. They are the fringe of the fringe, and this paper demonstrates why. Also listed as authors on this paper are the Wickramasinghe family, the Wallaces, Brigg-Kleiss, etc., etc., etc. The whole dang cabal I've dubbed the Panspermia Mafia. These are people who are committed to the religious belief that all life originated in space, and that even now, alien viruses are dropping on us to cause new diseases. They also tend to believe that there are alien artifacts on nearby planets, as well as fossils of ancient aliens, and that they can see alien organisms in NASA photos and electron micrographs of meteorites. Just the abstract of the paper tells us a lot about the content. It's a grab bag of discredited hypotheses that were promoted by non-biologists. First Fred Hoyle, and then his long-lived, persistently obnoxious apostle, Chandra Wickramasinghe, that still pollute the scientific literature because the Panspermia Mafia is really good at churning out numerous self-plagiarized papers that they pump out into a lot of illegitimate outlets, like the Journal of Cosmology, and that occasionally sneak by the gatekeepers trying to maintain the quality of good journals. All right, so here's the abstract. He says, we review the salient evidence consistent with or predicted by the Hoyle-Wickramasinghe H.W. thesis of cometary cosmic biology. Much of this physical and biological evidence is multifactorial. One particular focus are the recent studies which date the emergence of the complex retroviruses of vertebral lines at or just before the Cambrian explosion of 500 million years ago. This is kind of nonsense that the first vertebrates had these retroviruses doesn't mean they were causal. He says, such viruses are known to be plausibly associated with major evolutionary genomic processes. No, this is not known. We believe this coincidence is not fortuitous, but is consistent with a key prediction of H.W. theory, whereby major extinction, diversification, evolutionary boundaries coincide with virus-bearing cometary bolide bombardment events. I haven't seen any evidence of this at all. A second focus is the remarkable evolution of intelligent complexity in cephalopods, culminating in the emergence of the octopus. A third focus concerns the microorganism fossil evidence contained within meteorites, as well as the detection in the upper atmosphere of apparent incoming life-bearing particles from space. No, this has not been observed. And no, they just cut open asteroids, meteorites, and say, okay, this looks like a wobbly-goo to me. It's terrible science. In our view, the totality of the multifactorial data and critical analyses assembled by Fred Hoyle, Chandra Wickramasinghe, and their many colleagues since the 1960s, yes, their many colleagues, the Panspermia Mafia, since the 1960s leads to a very plausible conclusion. Life may have been seeded here on Earth by life-bearing comets as soon as conditions on Earth allowed it to flourish, about or just before 4.1 billion years ago, and living organisms such as space-resistant and space-hardy bacteria, viruses, more complex eukaryotic cells, fertilized ova and seeds have been continuously delivered ever since to Earth, so being one important driver of further terrestrial evolution, which has resulted in considerable genetic diversity and which has led to the emergence of mankind. What a load of crap. Every word of that is just goofy nonsense. Okay. You see, none of this is even plausible, and it's contradicted by the evidence. It's an amazingly bad paper, not cited by any other credible scientist, yet Powell is claiming this is the view of evolution, and that evolution teaches this. Let's just look at their claim about cephalopods, which Powell accurately quotes. It's so stupid that even a deeply ignorant clown like Powell can see that it's silly. Thus, the possibility that cryopreserved squid and/or octopus eggs arrived in icy bolides several hundred million years ago should not be discounted, as that would be a parsimonious cosmic explanation for the octopus's sudden emergence on Earth approximately 270 million years ago. Indeed, this principle applies to the sudden appearance in the fossil record of pretty well all major life forms, covered in the prescient concept of punctuated equilibrium by Eldridge and Gould, advanced in the early 1970s. And see the conceptual cartoon of Figure 6. I'll come back to that. First of all, he doesn't understand punctuated equilibrium because no, it is not a reasonable hypothesis supporting the idea of life forms falling from space. Punctuated equilibrium fits well into our understanding of terrestrial evolution. No outside agitators from Mars required. And this is a peculiar interpretation of parsimony. We have to overlook the fact that these icy bolides containing frozen squid eggs had to travel for millions of years with no degradation of the embryos, despite being bathed in radiation the whole way. We have to ignore how they got into the ocean. They fell through the atmosphere at high speed, cooking the contents, and then smashed into the ocean without breaking all the eggs. We have to intentionally neglect the big question: how did the eggs end up in a comet in the first place? Eggs imply a breeding squid population in interstellar space? On a planet? How did they get lofted into a trajectory leaving their star? Most importantly to a biologist, though, is that Steele and Powell's claim is built on a lie. Contrary to Powell's assertion that squids and octopuses have a different genetic build than any other creature in the world, this is not at all true. Cephalopods have the same core genetic elements as any other animal. Similar genes to control metabolism and cell division, just to name a few examples. Similar mitochondria. Just the fact that they have mitochondria is a hallmark of, similarity relationship to animals on Earth. How they chemically break down nutrients and to make energy is just like us. How their cells divide in mitosis and meiosis, it's just like us. And they also have the same developmental patterning genes, like the Hox genes and Wnt genes, just like us. They use cadherins and protocadherins to build their nervous systems, as we do. How did the extraterrestrial space squid, somehow laying eggs in comets around distant stars, somehow acquire common terrestrial genes? The same genes that specify form in all of us earthly animals. It makes no sense. None of their claims are compatible with any interpretation of evolutionary theory. These guys are not a source of information about what evolutionary theory says. Oh, by the way, here's a conceptual cartoon of figure 6. It doesn't make any sense either, but it reveals something else about this paper. It's a review paper with no data, no evidence. It's a compilation of assorted garbage from that army of authors, and all it has is hypothetical hand-waving. If their story is correct, they say, we can draw a stick figure pedigree that looks how we imagine it. In the same category is this illustration of how space squid evolved. You see, space squid landed on Earth, and then some of them were infected with space viruses that transformed them into octopuses. This is all the evidence they provide. No phylogenetic analysis, no comparison of the genes involved, no examination of actual traits of squid and octopuses, no appreciation of the details at all, just this cartoon. Wickramasinghe and his pals in the Panspermia Mafia are a disgrace to science. Not only do they practice bad science, but they corrupt the process of disseminating information. None of their papers would have made it past a competent editor or past peer reviewers, except what they've done is built a team of panspermists who review their own work. It's a real shame and an example of a whole small subdiscipline of science getting wrecked and discredited by fringe scientists. You should also know that Wickramasinghe was fired by Cardiff University a while back. He tried to defend himself with this argument. So he says, we continue to make headlines in various things that we do. Some of our work remains controversial, but it is the nature of science to promote controversy as long as it is intelligent controversy. No scientist is going to consider his work good because it makes headlines. The only reason the Panspermia Mafia makes headlines is because their claims are so outrageous, and they don't represent intelligent controversy. Okay, I'll wrap this up with a couple of conclusions. Matt Powell is a terrible critic of science. He has his own twisted and ultimately indefensible ideology, which he attempts to cover up by talking real fast and with great conviction. But what's revealed here is that he has no foundation and no context in which to judge the quality of scientific work. Yet he thinks he's an authority on what science is.
Is that if you are an atheist, if you're listening to this sermon and you're an atheist, you don't believe in science.
Yep, that's right.
Period.
One thing I know is that cherry-picking bad papers to claim that all of science is wrong is not something I believe in. It would be analogous to picking Matt Powell as representing all of Christianity rather than a fringe kook. I would hope good Christians out there would recognize that, no, Matt Powell is not a credible source, and he badly misrepresents the religion. I also know what science isn't. It's not about leaping to a conclusion, whether it's that Jesus created the earth 6,000 years ago, or that squid arose on a distant planet and hitched a ride on the back of asteroids to get here, and then ignoring all the evidence that refutes your hypothesis, as both Chandra Wickramasinghe and Matt Powell do regularly. Okay, I'm done. It's time for me to acknowledge all these wonderful people who have contributed to me on Patreon. I also wanted to highlight the shirt I happen to be wearing, which seems so appropriate to this particular topic. I hadn't planned that at all, but there it is. So, yeah, squid chasing down a Christian fish. I'm all for that. I also want to mention that you may have noticed all the clutter behind me. Somebody compared me to Jenny Nicholson. No, I can't do that. What it really is just I often call my granddaughter in the evening, and we've got a bunch of puppets and toys that we play with on the screen because we're wild and crazy grandparents, right? Anyway, so I got all these people scrolling by here. These are all great people who've been contributing to Patreon. I'm going to be posting this on Patreon for them first. Yeah, I hate to say it, but those of you who are not contributing to Patreon see it all a day later than they do. But that's okay, right? You'll forgive me. You'll still watch the video. So that's what I'm up to right now. What else do I need to tell you? Oh, I should, yeah, my voice is going out, so you may have noticed I'm getting a little raspy and rough there. I don't think it's anything serious, just kind of overdoing it lately. And also a little bit of languishing in my office. That's not good for your voice. My wife is here, but I don't even talk to her very much anymore. Nothing personal, just we're sitting here in quarantine. It's terrible. Okay, admire the shirt. Thank the good people on the list coming by. I will try to do this again in a week or two. I may actually even do a open conversation next week here on YouTube. Okay, have you had enough of the splendor? We'll talk to you later. Thanks for stopping by.